So just a quick overview of our agenda for today. We're going to talk about public charge, the current rule as it stands, recent changes that took abroad that have already taken place abroad, and the proposed rule change that would really change what's happening here in the U.S. And then I'm going to kick things over to Kat also to talk about how to talk about public charge with immigrant families and share some resources that we have for you and your consumers and clients through the campaign. Next slide. So we've actually been watching this policy since the first days of the Trump administration. There's actually an unsigned executive order that was leaked to the media back in 2017. And then in January of 2018, as I mentioned, the State Department made changes to something called the Foreign Affairs Manual that governs how public charge determinations happen abroad, and Kat will speak more about that. Last fall, there was a proposed rule change that was published in the Federal Register for about 60 days for a public comment period and ended on December 10th. And now, in terms of the state of play, we're waiting for a final rule to be issued from the Department of Homeland Security. And once that's issued, there'll be an effective date of about 60 days after the rule is published in that Federal Register. And then until all of that happens, really the current narrower public charge policy is going to be taking effect, is going to be in effect, actually. So next, I'll kick it over to Kat, who will talk about the current public charge rule test and some of the changes that we've already seen.
Great. Thanks, Connie. Can we go to the next slide? So basically, let's go over a little bit about what current public charge policy looks like today and as it exists. So next slide. So where does public charge come up? A public charge assessment is made in basically two main ways: when an individual is seeking to enter the U.S. with a visa, or when they're applying for a green card or lawful permanent resident status, an LPR. But it's important to remember, keep in mind that some individuals that are living in the U.S. have to leave the U.S. and return to their country of origin in order to get a green card. A green card holder that leaves the U.S. for more than 6 months and then re-enters, that person would also be subject to a public charge test. Next slide. So does public charge apply to everyone? And the answer is no. Public charge does not apply to all immigrants. And listed below on this slide, you'll see some of the examples of who public charge does not apply to. So LPRs, or green card holders that are applying for citizenship, public charge does not apply to them. They are not subject to the public charge test. Additionally, certain humanitarian immigrants, such as refugees or asylees, are also not subject to public charge when they are seeking status through one of those pathways. Next slide. So what is public charge? It's a long-standing test, and it's defined as a person who's considered likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. So basically, they're trying to identify people who would rely on government as their main source of support. Under longstanding guidance, the public charge determination has been limited to an evaluation or dependence on two main categories of benefits: cash assistance, so like TANF or SSI, and long-term care at the government's expense. Other types of public benefits programs have been specifically excluded, and because of this very narrow definition of public charge, there have been very few denials based on public charge. This means that immigrants and their families could participate in programs for which they are eligible without fear that accessing programs like, say, Medicaid or housing assistance would have negative consequences for their immigration status. So for a long time, this has allowed us to give a clear message to immigrants that it's okay to participate in other public programs. And in practice, if you have a valid affidavit of support, which we'll go over a little bit later, in your immigration application, it's generally been enough to avoid a public charge determination. Next slide. So this is what the current public charge test looks like when you're applying in the U.S. So the public charge determination is based on an assessment of many factors, and this is known as the Totality of Circumstances test. By statute, the immigration officer must look at all of an applicant's circumstances, including their age, health, family status, financial status, education and skills, And one of the factors that must also be taken into account is what's called the affidavit of support, which some but not all immigrants have. This is a contract with a sponsor who's usually a family member. They have to sign and accept financial responsibility for an immigrant who is moving permanently to the U.S. In practice, if there is an issue with one of those factors you see listed there or benefits used, they look to the affidavit of support. I'll also mention that the decision is forward-looking and can't be based only on past circumstances. So the fact that someone has just graduated from school or has a job offer, this can balance out the past use of benefits. But most importantly, no one single factor you see listed here can determine whether or not someone is deemed to be a public charge. Next slide. So public charge and its application is a little different, though, for immigrants that are applying for abroad, kind of like Connie was talking about earlier. So I'm going to take a quick couple of minutes to talk about some of the changes to the Foreign Affairs Manual. Next slide. So the State Department provides what's called the Foreign Affairs Manual, which serves as an instruction manual for U.S. consulate offices abroad. You might be wondering, what does the State Department have to do with immigration? I thought this was all under DHS, but it turns out they actually have kind of a sizable role. Officials in U.S. consulates and embassies abroad make critical decisions about whether to grant people permission to enter the U.S. They grant what is called a non-immigrant visa, like a tourist visa or a student visa, and they also provide immigrant visas so people can come to the U.S. and be admitted as permanent residents, green card holders, or lawful permanent residents. This pathway for entering the U.S. is known as consular processing. And so this instruction manual, this Foreign Affairs Manual, and its guidance is pretty important. Next slide. So for your clients or your consumers that have loved ones that are applying from abroad, these rules, the rules that I just mentioned for under the Foreign Affairs Manual, these rules only apply to people that are applying to enter the U.S. from abroad. So that could be a client's husband, a client's mother, or another family member. The State Department revised that instruction manual back in 2018, and although they didn't change the definition of public charge, they made quite a number of other significant changes. They're shifting away from relying on an affidavit of support as sufficient on its own to meeting the public charge test. They're shifting away from looking at all the individual factors and the totality of circumstances test. They can look at the use of non-cash benefits. They can also look at benefits that are used by sponsors or family members. And I know it might feel like I'm getting way too in the weeds on some of this public charge policy, but it's really important to note that these changes could impact the loved ones of your clients and consumers. And it also might be contributing to some of the misunderstandings about public charge because they're being applied so differently. So I just wanted to note those two differences, and we'll walk through some examples later on. And now I'm going to kick it over to Connie, who will talk about a little bit how the public charge test would change under the proposed regulation.
Great, thanks so much, Kat. Next slide, please. So what would these changes look like? For the next couple of slides, I'm gonna go over kind of three main buckets in which these changes will be taking place. Next slide. So before I start, just want to note that actually the proposed regulation is over 400 pages long. And really, everything that I'm going to be outlining here may change and may look different with regards to the final rule. So I wouldn't put too much stock into all the changes that I'm going to outline here. Just know that these are some of the changes that we do anticipate. And as I mentioned, the changes can be really divided up into three buckets. Number one, the draft rule actually changes the definition of who is considered a public charge. Secondly, it actually adds new factors to that totality of circumstances test that Kat outlined, which will ultimately make it harder for those with low income to pass. And lastly, and this has been the most commonly discussed when looking at news stories and such, the proposal would add new benefits programs to the list that can be considered when making a public charge determination. Next slide. So that first bucket of changes is actually a change in the definition. So the current definition is a person who's likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. And as mentioned, the definition really considers whether one's main source of support is cash assistance or long-term care at the government expense. As proposed, that definition would change to someone who likely receives one or more public benefits. And so this shift not just, considers whether a benefit would be a main source of support, but actually expands that list, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide. In terms of the totality of circumstances factors, you'll see 6 listed up here, and I'll go kind of one by one as to some of the proposed changes would look like. So with regards to age, the proposed rule would basically, what happened, actually with regards to proposed changes before I start, basically it adds more color and definition to what were essentially amorphous factors that were included in the current public charge test that's applied. And so it takes away it gives an officer less discretion in terms of assessing a person's whole situation. And you'll see that as I go through some of the proposed changes. So with regards to age, what the proposed rule says is that being too young or too old, so under the age of 18 or older than 61, would be weighed negatively. And being of so-called prime working age, so ages 18 to 60 under the proposed rule, would be a positive factor. With regards to one's health, they will consider whether an immigrant has been diagnosed with a medical condition that will likely require extensive medical treatment or institutionalization, or consider, will their health primarily interfere with their ability to care for themselves, to attend school, or to work once coming to the U.S. For family, basically the larger your family is, or the more children that you have, the harder it is, the more scrutiny that you'll be receiving. That being said, we've also received a lot of questions about dependent children generally, and whether or not their use of benefits could create a problem for a family member applying for a green card or a visa. And I just want to state that the receipt of public benefits by dependents will not directly be a factor in the applicant, so the family member's public charge test. However, if that child is an immigrant and applying for an immigration benefit themselves, their own use of benefits will count towards their own public charge test. In terms of income, the draft regulation also weighs low income negatively. Right now, with regards to the current public charge test, the government looks really, as Kat mentioned, to a sponsor's income and not really the immigrant's income at all. And what the proposed changes would impose is an immigrant test on an income test on the immigrant applicant themselves and not just the sponsor. There's only one heavily weighed positive factor here, which is a household income of 250% of the federal poverty guidelines. So that means to avoid scrutiny under the public charge test, a family of 4 would need to earn about $63,000 a year, which is incidentally higher than the median income in the U.S. If an individual's household income is less than 125% of the federal poverty guidelines, so about $31,000 for a family of 4, that would be a negative factor. In terms of education and skills, they will consider not just the level of education obtained, but whether a person has proficient in English as a factor to consider here. And lastly, for that affidavit support, just as reflected within the FAM, the Foreign Affairs Manual, and having an affidavit of support is not enough. And it also outlines some scrutiny that an officer must undertake, so such as looking at the sponsor's income and their assets and resources, their relationship to the applicant, and whether they're living together with the applicant, and whether the sponsor had submitted affidavits of support with respect to other individuals as well. So, as you can see, there's quite a number of different outline factors here. And it may look different, but really at the end of the day, just to outline, there's only really one heavily weighed positive factor, and that's really having a high income. So having, at least 250% a household income that's above the federal poverty guidelines. Next slide. So it also expands, as Kat mentioned, the list of benefits in the proposed rule. So in addition to cash assistance and long-term institutional care, it adds 4 new types of benefits that can be considered as part of the test. So most Medicaid programs, with the exception of emergency Medicaid and certain disability services offered at schools, SNAP or food stamps, Medicare Part D low-income subsidy. So this would really affect low-income seniors, immigrant seniors, as well as housing assistance. And this relates to public housing, such as Section 8 housing vouchers and rental assistance as well. Next slide. So one thing that I really want to stress is that other than cash or long-term care benefits that are paid for by the government, any benefits used before the rule is final and effective will not be considered in the public charge test currently. So under this new proposal, if finalized as such, the Homeland Security Department cannot judge public benefits received before the rule is finalized, any program additions like the 4 new additional benefits programs that are added to the test, as well as any other benefits that are not cash or long-term care. And just, right now, as I mentioned, the government is still reviewing comments, and so we have quite a bit of time before this rule becomes effective. Next slide. So these are some of the benefits that are not included in the rule. And just to note, this is not a comprehensive list. It's just a lot of the programs that we get questions about. Any benefit that's not specifically listed in the regulation is not included. And I think just to take a step back, there was quite a bit of confusion because there were leaked drafts that included a lot of these programs. And it was really due to the advocacy of our partners all across the country that really that pushed back before the rule was even proposed officially in the public register that led to the removal of several of these advocacy or these benefits programs from the proposed list. Next slide. So as you can see, the proposal is really a radical change to how public charge currently applies. It really broadens the concept of public charge from those who are primarily dependent to those who likely would just have a modest use of public benefits. It adds more color and criteria to each element of the totality of circumstances test, and really the net effect is that it creates a lot of ways for people to fail the public charge test. So if they have a low income, if they don't speak English well, if they have a medical condition, those will all serve as negative factors. And really the only sure way to pass muster would be to have a high income. And then lastly, it does expand the list of applicable public benefits programs that will be considered under the test. Next slide. So as I mentioned, there's actually an existing 1999 public charge guidance that really governs the current test as is, and that will still be in place until the rule is finalized. And, keep in mind that the final rule can look really different from what was proposed and outlined today. But I think, at the end of the day, and really we aren't, there's actually been situations where a regulation has never been finalized, although I have to say that with this administration, I'm pretty sure that will be. But in the interim, I know that a lot of folks are fearful, are scared, and are already disenrolling from benefits programs. And so I think Kat's going to talk more about how to talk to immigrant families about public charge. And I'll kick it back over to you.
Thanks, Connie. Yeah. So next slide. So, wow, that was a lot of information, right? So how can we talk to immigrant families about public charge? It's really important that you're prepared simple and clear messages for immigrant families. We have a resource that actually covers a lot of this information. It's just been recently updated. I'll be sure to send it over to Steve and the team over at LA Best Babies Network as soon as it's finalized, but it should be actually coming out tomorrow. Next slide. So if you had, the 30-second elevator pitch, these are the 6 top things that you would probably want to cover in a conversation you might be having with an immigrant family about public charge. So number 1, the use of public benefits alone will not make you a public charge. Like we said before, immigration officials must look at all of your circumstances in determining whether or not you're likely to become a public charge in the future. Again, that's your age, your health, your assets, resources. So positive factors like having a job can be weighed against negative factors like having used, say, a public benefit in the past. Next, the public charge determination is a forward-looking test. Just because someone uses a benefit now doesn't mean they'll always use benefits or use benefits even in the future. Even if the rule changes, you'll have a chance to show, immigrant families will have a chance to show why they're not likely to rely on certain benefits in the future. Next, some immigrants are exempt by law from the public charge test. So public charge does not apply to all immigrants. I'll just repeat that one more time. Public charge does not apply to all immigrants. This includes refugees, asylees, survivors of trafficking, TRU visa applicants or holders, and a variety of other statuses that we mentioned earlier. Next, the proposed rule is not retroactive. Under the proposal, benefits that were used previous benefit programs that were previously not part of the public charge test, such as Medicaid or SNAP, will be considered only if those benefits are received after the rule is final. The rule is not final, so the use of benefits right now is not being applied to public charge determinations in the future. Next, personal information is safe. There are so many federal and state laws that protect the privacy of people who apply for or receive public benefits programs. Applications for these programs should not request information about the immigration status of non-applicants in the household. Benefit agencies may share information with other government agencies, but only for purposes of administering those programs, and that with very limited exceptions. You can provide only the information necessary, but you should not misrepresent anything when you're completing a public benefit application or dealing with any government agency. And then lastly, we are continuing to fight this attack on immigrant families. This proposal is cruel, and advocates have been and will use every tool at their disposal to stop it. Organizations are already preparing for legal challenges, and state and local governments are also planning to sue if the administration tries to take this any further. Next slide. So why don't we walk through some examples of conversations and questions that you might be getting from clients and from families about public charge. Next slide. So sorry, my artwork is a little crude, but we will work through it. So here's one. I was granted asylum status a few months ago, but now I'm worried that using health benefits is going to stop me from getting my green card. Your response might sound something like this. As an asylee, you are exempt from the public charge determination. Public charge will not apply to you. And this also applies to any of the statuses you saw listed on slide 7 of this presentation. Next slide. Here's another one. I'm scared to say enrolled in WIC. I know that WIC is a public benefit. Your response might sound something like this. Yes, you are correct. WIC is a public benefit, but it's not considered in the public charge test. You should have no fear staying enrolled in WIC. And this currently also applies to all of those other benefits that we had listed on slide 19. Next slide. Here's one. I've heard about this rule for a long time now. Are you sure it's not already in effect? Your answer might go like this. For public charge decisions being made in the U.S., nothing has changed yet, and we recommend that you continue to get the help that you need. Next slide. So here's one. My friend says public charge will apply to her, so she disenrolled from Medi-Cal. She said I should too. Your response should look something like this. Everyone's situation is different. Before you make any decisions that may impact you and your family's health, please seek advice from a knowledgeable source. Next slide. I keep seeing news articles that tell me different information about public charge. Who should I believe? You can say that news outlets sometimes get information wrong, so it's important to get expert advice. Seek advice from a knowledgeable source. This may be a legal services attorney or a social service organization that serves immigrant communities. Next slide. Here's one. My husband is going to join me in the U.S., but he's applying from Mexico. Does public charge apply for him? If your family have plans to apply for a green card or visa outside of the U.S., you should talk with an expert before making decisions. This is an instance where, remember those FAM, the instruction manual for consular processing, that's where those changes kick in. So even though it may not affect the client, it might affect their loved ones coming into the country. Next slide. So where can I get more information? A lot of the information that we were just talking about is all listed on our protectingimmigrantfamilies.org website. Next slide. Specifically, we have created a new page on our site specifically for service providers and communities. We want to make sure that our partners have all the tools and the resources that they need to speak with immigrant families and address the issues that are impacting their communities. So you'll see a couple of examples of documents that we already have listed. That document you see in the lower left-hand corner, how to talk about public charge with immigrants and their families, that's actually where a lot of the information for this webinar came from. And then we have other ones coming out soon, like Going to the Doctor, Protect Your Health, a guide to creating safe spaces for early childhood programs and daycare centers. And if you have a need for a specific community-facing resource that you can't find on our website, please reach out to me. My email address, and we could probably send it out later too, but it's lundie@nilc.org, LUNDIE@NILC.org. Next slide. And if you're interested in getting more involved with PIF, there are a bunch of different ways you can get involved. We have an email list where we basically share developments and other threats that are impacting immigrant families. Every Monday, you'll just get an email that provides the state of play. This will also be the email list that gets the first, I guess, message about when the public charge proposal is finalized. We also invite people to share their stories. Everyone's voice in this space and in this movement is important. So we have a link here for people to share their stories. Even if you're not an impacted immigrant yourself, like service providers are on the front lines of seeing the impacts that this has for families and for communities. You're there, you see it. So your stories matter just as much in order to document the harm of some of these policies. And then finally, we have a Take Action page where we're listing ways you can take action, like submitting comments on different regulations, ways to sign on to different action items from organizations. We also have an events page where we'll be posting webinars similar to this one and different webinars that cover all the other attacks on immigrant families. Next slide. Oh, okay. So I guess this is the question and answer portion. Thank you for sticking with us this whole time. We'd be happy to answer your questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Kat and Connie. I'm going to give it a shot here, putting everybody out in the open, unmuted. Sometimes we do have some issues with sound and feedback and whatnot. So if that happens, I guess we can mute and then just take questions in the chat box. But I'll give it a shot unmuting everyone here. Okay, so yeah, if you're having any side conversations, you are now unmuted, just as a heads up. And if you're not talking, if you could please just put us on mute, use your phone's mute function. I guess if there's any questions, go ahead and speak your mind.
The world may never.
Okay. Has anyone had experience with clients talking about public charge and concerns? I know you have. I've talked to you about that, and I know that is an ongoing issue. But maybe there's something you could share with the person.
This is Lydia from Northridge. I've actually, based on everything going on right now and the climate we're in right now, when I do enrollment, that is an issue that I do deal with when I go into some of the clinics that are Medi-Cal only and see a high number of immigrant families. They are very less likely to enroll in the program because of fear. They do have the fear. And the thing is, you can tell them over and over again, explain to them, yes, we're a grant-funded program. This is not going to show up in any public charge. This has nothing to do with Medi-Cal or any insurance. They still have those fears. And I think we're going to see that for a little while. And eventually it will die down and people will start getting more understanding and the scare tactics will die down. But yes, we do see it. I know, and I can't speak for everyone, but even in a lot of the clinics that were heavily Medi-Cal patients, they're not seeing as many patients anymore. I actually see more private insurance patients than I do Medi-Cal insurance patients right now. So I have noticed the difference. And again, it'll change over time, but for right now, that's the climate.
Yeah, and just as a response to that, I think we're seeing that all throughout the country. The totality of circumstances test, and what I had a partner tell me this, and it really resonated with me. When you look at the totality of circumstances, there's nothing that you can do to change your age. There's nothing that you can do to change your income, but you can, change whether you disenroll or seek out public benefits programs. It's the only thing that I think immigrants and their families feel like are in their control. And so despite the fact that it is one of several factors, right, that are considered with regards to public charge, I think people fixate on it quite a bit. And so, and I think, we really encourage our partners to have honest conversations and say, hey, you're right. This is, I can't tell you a guarantee of yes or no, right? In terms of, the choices that you should make for you and your family, but know that this is going to really impact your health, right? And your ability to be secure. And then, there's other factors to be considered, not just public benefits use. And so I think, I think it really depends on the risk, the level of risk, I guess, that, an individual client wants to take on versus not. But, I think our focus within the campaign has been, how do we provide accurate, information, up-to-date information that really helps folks make informed decisions for themselves and their families. So I don't know if that helps, but I think there's this over fixation that's really happening when it comes to public benefits use. And we're finding that it doesn't matter whether there's benefits, the certain benefits that are included in the public charge test versus not. I mean, I've heard some stories of, accessing nonprofit programs being considered as a public benefit. And really it's being that type of, that's being used and wielded as a tool by the administration. So it's unfortunate.
Right.
Hi, this is Anna. I wanted to thank you for this great informative presentation. I think you've given us some language that we can definitely dissect and take back to both our providers, our clinics that we work with, and also the families that we enroll in the program. One of the things that we notice at our site is that when we're completing, first of all, the messaging, I think is really important, and a lot of us in the different home visiting programs are using the term, this is not a government-funded program, and that kind of takes away a little bit that fear of enrolling in something that is funded through federal government or state-funded. But also, once we come back and we do enrollments with the families over the phone, we have to be very tactful with how we ask certain questions. For example, we ask families, what country were you born in? How long have you been in the country? So, we have to figure out a way to deliver that question in such a way that is not felt like we're assessing for immigration status. Although we do say at the beginning that is, the program is a universal home visitation program, and we serve families despite of their immigration status and so forth. But I think that your message is really good. I really like the questions and the answers that you provided, because it gives us some words to kind of take away and go back and use when we're addressing some of those questions. So thank you for that. And I guess for all of us, I think it's just about really fine-tuning our message and continue to describe this program in such a way that it doesn't feel like they're receiving government support or assistance in any way. And I do have a question for you. Are there some proposed dates as to when this piece of legislation will be reviewed again? And is there like public comment where folks can submit, make calls or express their opposition to some of the things that are being proposed?
Kat, do you want to answer the second one, and I can supplement if needed.
Yeah. So this regulation was posted through the Federal Register on October. There was a public comment period from October until December, and now they have to review. Basically, I wish we could take all credit for the 266,000 comments that got submitted on this one regulation. But basically, it's DHS's job right now to review all of that, and the members of the PIF campaign, partners, and other organizations made sure that they had a lot of stuff that they had to go through and address. So right now, that's sort of where the timeline is on where the proposal is. Once they're done reviewing the comments, actually, though, they'll be able to put it back to the Office of Management and Budget, and then from there, it will get posted and finalized. And there will be a 60-day, so we're calling it like the transition period. There will be a period of time before the rule is actually in effect where families could, potentially reassess, okay, well, this change is happening. What am I going to do for me and my family? So that opportunity is down the road. We're just not there yet. You want to add anything, Connie?
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much for providing your feedback. I'm really curious to hear about, it's really interesting to talk about how this is not a government-funded program and kind of, as a talking point. And so we actually have a community education subcommittee of partners throughout the U.S. That have been really thinking about what would be effective messaging that is community-facing and that would, actually help assuage some of the fears that we're seeing amongst community members. And so I really appreciate that feedback. Secondly, with regards to the data capture point that you brought up, we're going to actually have a webinar coming up that's actually going to have, that's all about, number one, documenting the harm to make the case as to how this is really affecting your programs and whatnot, and also on what information to capture versus not. And so I highly encourage you to join our listserv, and it's going to be at the end of this month. And then I think lastly, so Kat is right. We had a public comment period that really governed, how public charge is applied for people who are seeking admission into the U.S., right? So seeking those visas, seeking those green cards to enter the U.S. There is, as of Friday, or last Friday, there was a story that came out in Reuters that talked about the deportability grounds on public charge, and that will be open again for public comment period, likely 60 days, and we are bracing ourselves for that challenge. And so we're going to need everybody's help once again in terms of mobilizing folks to submit comments and to really oppose the rule change. And this would be coming out of the Department of Justice and not the not the Homeland Security Department. And so, yeah, we will need all your help in terms of fighting back against that proposed rule change.
Thank you so much for your answer and the information.
No worries. Any other questions?
I don't know. Did you have any other questions for the group?
I just want to add, my only concern right now with our patients or our clients is that a lot of people are not going to access prenatal care because they're afraid to go on Medi-Cal. And even though you say that probably being on emergency Medi-Cal won't really count, but a lot of people don't want to take that chance. They're afraid. So I worry how many people are not getting the prenatal care that they need, and is this going to also increase the likelihood of people being homeless? So those are my kind of things that, go on in my head because of this whole situation with public charge.
I think you're right. And we actually have quite a number of research partners that are part of the campaign, including Manat Health. And they actually estimate that the chilling effect, the so-called chilling effect, is going to be about 26 million people that are going to be, a lot. And that's why I think we need everybody's help to really do the community education, the partner education, because as you can see, this rule is really wonky. It's really complicated and convoluted.
Right.
And to be honest, that was probably part of the calculus by this administration in terms of carrying forth with this. And so, what we found is that as we're doing these presentations and talking to folks, that it's taking quite a bit of multiple tries to really understand the ins and outs, and then kind of coupled with, I think, the general fear that's within immigrant communities, like it's really a hard nut. It's been a hard nut to crack. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'll also echo Connie's point that one of the best strategies we have right now to sort of limit the chilling effect is to do that community education and reassure people that this doesn't apply to everybody. The rules are it's not retroactive. The more knowledge and the more resources we have out there, the stronger we get to be.
And I know the campaign, as you mentioned in one of the earlier slides, you are collecting stories and accounts of how this issue affects programs like ours. So I would invite everyone on the call, if you have an example like that. I know, Lydia, you mentioned some fairly specific examples about enrollment and even the number of folks you see at clinics. And I think you had mentioned to me earlier about some of the WIC offices you go to. They seem to be sparsely populated now. But if you have a specific example or story you can share, feel free. You can do that now. I guess if something comes to you later or something happens later, you can, I think, send that to Kat and Connie. Is there anyone who has any?
I'm just going to enter my email into the chat box real fast, and Connie's.
Yeah, we will certainly share that. I should also mention we're recording this, and we'll share your slides, as well as the resources that are linked in the presentation with everybody, and your contact information in a follow-up email. Nobody has any more examples they want to share? Or questions?
So while you guys are thinking about your last questions, I just want to say, thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you. And of the story that you shared, it's so helpful because I think, one of the things, one of the top priorities for the campaign this year is, how do we really get resources that really resonate and is helpful to you? And so the more examples that we have, in our arsenal to really think about, what messages would be effective, what type of resources would be effective, we really welcome it. I realize that it's a very depressing topic that we just covered today. But yeah, I would really encourage you to reach out if you have any, further questions and whatnot. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, we really appreciate your being available and providing such a terrific, thorough presentation. I know there's a lot of information. As I said, we will have the slides for people to reference later, but you really covered a lot and really useful information too, not just about the regulation, but really addressing our work in outreach with the clients that we serve. So thanks so much for tailoring it for us.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, last chance. Anybody have a question or comment about the public charge issue or supporting immigrant families generally?
I do have one. I'm sorry, I like to talk or whatever, but this is Lydia from Northridge. It kind of is along those lines, but I wanted to mention too that, and this kind of it goes along the lines because a lot of us deal with immigrant families. Our 2020 census is coming up, and a lot of those families won't participate in it because, again, they're afraid that information they put on the census application is going to come back and haunt them, meaning somebody's going to come to their house, immigration, and pick them up. And so a lot of them won't fill out that paperwork. And what happens is they don't get the resources into their community. Mm-hmm. And so It's very important if you can let your families know, even though they're undocumented, fill out the paperwork because it has nothing to do with their immigration status and the immigration coming to their house or the federal government knowing anything about their family. All it is basically how many people live in that geographic region and what are their needs. And so the more people that fill out their census paperwork, the more money that comes into their community to help. And so even if they're undocumented, it doesn't matter because none of that information, no specific information about people is going to go to the president or the federal government. It's all statistics. And so when you don't fill out the paperwork, that's less money that comes into your community. And so what I did find out is that one of the most unrepresented population that wasn't taken into account from the last census was children from the ages of 0 to 5. A lot of them were underrepresented grossly. And so basically a lot of that money did not go to that age group. So I guess people thought maybe, I'm pregnant, so I don't count this person, but you do need to count that person. And because of the program we are involved in, that's very important. So again, let your families know, please fill out the census paperwork. It only helps their community. And yes, if you're pregnant or you have children from 0 to 5, please include them in the census. And that's my spiel.
Amen.
Spiel. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Who else has a spiel? I have not to call you out, but Curie or Putavi, have you experienced this in the Cambodian community? We have just for our presenters, we do have outreach specialists who focus on the Cambodian community in the Long Beach, South Bay area. I'm wondering if you've heard concerns about this issue. Okay, we may have lost.
Were you asking anybody, Steve, or specifically just me or TV?
Yeah, I was kind of calling you out, actually. If you did have, I mean, anybody, sure, but I thought you might have some something to share on that. I was curious if you've encountered that and how big of an issue that is in the Cambodian community.
I don't at this moment. Sorry, I'm not exploring the host here right now.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I was just curious if you've experienced concerns around this issue.
So this is Kat, and I'll just sort of add one more thing in terms of, so immigrants being afraid to access benefits for which they are eligible isn't necessarily like a brand new concept. Like it existed way before anyone knew like what the heck is public charge. And it's sort of just been like this, not urban legend, but like this sort of like boogeyman that even if you're eligible, don't enroll in benefits because maybe it comes to hurt you later. And public charge is basically like the boogeyman coming to life for a lot of people. So even if someone is like hesitant to access a benefit, or even like they may not even know what public charge is, they might have heard the rumors, they may not know what it is by name, but sort of the fight and the community education fight we have is not just to public charge, but for almost like this long-standing fear that immigrants have always had with accessing any public program. So that's why community education is also so important in the next couple of years.
I was going to also add on that for certain communities are targeted with mismessaging on mainstream media. I know in the Latino community, there's tons of Spanish commercials from attorneys that may mention that, or there may be some propaganda around in different neighborhoods from people trying to market their legal services where they may be referencing public charge in a very incorrect way. And so that's also something that is very specific to certain communities or certain ethnic groups.
Mm.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that we've heard, and I think for Cambodians specifically, a lot of them come over as refugees. And as you remember, refugees just generally, right, as a category are exempt from the public charge test. So what we found is that, really the impacts have, and the kind of the general messages we see from different, communities of color have like resonated differently, right? And so I think you're totally right there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I agree. That was greatly said. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I see Puthavi is put in the chat box. Thank you for your comment, Puthavi. She mentioned that she hasn't really had that concern in the Cambodian community. So maybe, as you mentioned, it's related to refugee status and so on. But a larger portion of that community fits into that group.
Yeah, absolutely.
As to Anna's comment about some of the information circulating in the Latino community, I know that the issue with notarios is big. That there is a fair amount of like not so legitimate folks offering immigration services and probably offering bad advice.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not limited to the Latino community. For the Chinese community, called them chintarios, and for the Korean community, called them cortarios. I mean, like they're really all over the place. So yeah, it's quite unfortunate. This is a new thing that you're learning from me. So I think you're right. There's and which is I think why folks like y'all are so important, right? And in terms of being really trusted resources of information from community members. And so, yeah, thanks again. Great. So Steve, are we at time? Just wanted to make sure that we weren't taking too much.
No, this is great. Yeah, we have allotted an hour and a half, so we have until 3:30. I was going to see if we're finished with the presentation and there are no more questions or comments related to this specific issue. We could open it up to kind of a more open forum about outreach, about our work. And Kat and Connie, you're welcome to stay for that if you wanted to, but you know, we could let you go if you have other
yeah, unfortunately, I do. Sorry.
I know I told you that about an hour for the presentation, and we're actually right exactly on that hour. So.
Yay. No, but thanks again. Please feel free to reach out. And thanks so much for really the opportunity to speak with y'all and for sharing your thoughts. And hopefully this will be a continuing conversation. But yeah, I'm going to just excuse myself and let y'all go to the next agenda item.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate it. We want to thank you again, both of you, so